Alright, so recently in Honkai Star Rail, I've noticed something that's been coming up time and time again whenever I see people talk about the meta. And at least so far, it's something that hasn't really had that big of a mainstream focus for most of the game's lifespan so far. If you're not sure exactly what I'm talking about yet, it's actually the recent rise of Sustainless team compositions. For those of you unfamiliar, a Sustainless team comp is one where you drop your sustain, or I guess your healer as another way to put it, for another option that may do something that the healer, well, doesn't. This does mean that you're definitely at risk of dying early on into your runs, and you might have to reset a few times to finally get the clear, but for some people, Sustainless team compositions are like the way to play the game. Now, obviously, Sustainless team compositions have always been a thing. Like, I'm pretty sure I've got some footage of a zero cycle from way back in 2.x when Fei Zhao released. I was definitely zero cycling when Acheron released, and I know for a fact that people were doing them well before that point during 1.x2, and pretty much all of those zero cycle clears were Sustainless. But with that said, for most players, and also for most of the time that the game has been out, it hasn't really been anyone's focus unless you're the kind of player that, actually does do those zero cycles or whatever. Nowadays though, I would actually say it's changed. Like, at least personally, I would actually say that the community mindset has shifted quite a bit, and going for Sustainless team compositions is actually a much more normalized thing now. Like, it's not just the zero cyclers that do Sustainless team compositions anymore, and instead there are actually some teams that literally play at their best when you don't have a sustain in those teams. And overall, I think this has actually resulted in a semi-decent amount of diversity in terms of what you can actually play, albeit at the cost of probably going just a little bit crazy in terms of resetting a few times to actually get your clear. So today, what I wanted to do is go through the different teams that are being or can be ran Sustainless, the characters that enable it, kind of talk about the variety of reasons that they play that way, and most importantly, what caused the community shift that made this style of gameplay a lot more normalized. So let's talk about it. First and foremost, I think it's probably worth talking about when this started to happen, because for the most part, I think that directly ties into the teams that are being played Sustainless in the current state of the game. If I could pinpoint one time frame, or honestly one specific character that threw Sustainless into the limelight, it would probably have to be Finon back in 3.4. Now, I do want to preface by saying that Finon absolutely can be played with a sustain. Dan PT is great for him, and you won't really find faults with slotting him in as one of Finon's teammates. But Dan PT released 2 patches after Finon, so people were pretty much forced to run him Sustainless until then, and even now I would say that people generally still view Sustainless Finon as a more than viable option despite Dan PT's release. For those of you unfamiliar with how Finon plays, in short form, for every buff that he gets 1 point of his ultimate, and then once he has 12 of those points he can use his ult, which is what transforms him into his god mode state. Apart from that, he can also get points by using his own skill, and obviously Cyrene can just instantly charge it too. Basically though, what his gameplay boils down to is using your skill on Finon, then using some form of action advancer like Sunday for example, who also offers buffs, and then repeating that until you can get Finon into his god mode form. The thing is though, once you're in his god mode form, everyone else is removed from the field. So while yes, in the build-up phase when you're trying to get Finon into his god form, a sustain like Dan PT has a ton of value, on the other hand, once you're in that god mode, the value is definitely a bit lessened. Not fully to be clear, but definitely enough to consider not running a sustain like Dan PT to begin with, and instead just running an extra buffer or an action advancer or whatever else. So really, this was basically the first time that a character that didn't necessarily want sustains was kind of shoved in players' faces. Sure, yeah, you can still run Dan PT like I said, or you can drop him and get into Finon's ult state quicker while kind of just hoping that your team doesn't die beforehand. And as a result of this, I think that this is where people really started to think about how their teams were actually being put together. Like, at least in my opinion, Finon was basically the catalyst for the average player to start thinking, well, okay, if my Finon can get by because he removes people from the field, can I do anything similar with my other characters? And obviously, yes, like I said at the beginning of this video, zero cyclers have been doing this kind of stuff forever, but at the same time, like I mentioned, this was kind of the first time this was basically pushed onto the average player as the potential best way to play a specific character. It didn't actually stop there though, because soon after Finon's release, we had Sarija release in 3.5, who not only paired very well with Finon, but also worked with Anoxa and even Archer as 4 slots instead of a sustain, and from that point on, I feel it only really continued. 3.5 brought along Heiselins, who, while not very relevant for sustainless teams at the time of her release, did become relevant in 4.0 when Black Swan got her Nova Flare buff and a viable dot team became Kafka, Black Swan, Heiselins, and Cyrene. 3.7 came with Cyrene, who instantly gives the entire team their ultimates with the right setup, which enables certain comps to clear where they otherwise wouldn't. And 3.8 came with Dahlia and a revitalization of Super Break, which was always something that people toyed around with in terms of playing Sustainless, even before Finon brought it to the forefront. But even though it was something that people had kind of like always toyed around with, Dahlia's release made Sustainless the actual best way to play the Super Break team as a whole, with Fugue and the HMC or Ron May as the other two supports. And right now, we're in 4.0 where there's enemies that literally have to be hit with elation damage to not nuke your team, but when you do deal elation damage to them, their damage gets neutered enough that playing Sustainless is actually more than viable for all of the different elation teams that are currently available. So honestly, I think ever since around the time that Finon released, the game hasn't really hidden away the option of going Sustainless to just the people that want to do zero cycles and whatnot. And to be clear, I'm not saying that playing without a sustain is easy or that anyone can do it. I mean, we all know the horror stories of TikTok HSR teams. But I do think that at least nowadays there are actually quite a few team options that players have that can be played Sustainless that I would consider to be legitimately supported by the game. Like yeah, if you're playing Super Break, you can still run Linksha if you really want to, but at the same time, it is completely normal to forego playing her, because with the way that Super Break plays, I mean, you barely get hit anyway. And with Finon teams, like I mentioned earlier, he literally removes all of his teammates from the field so that they can't get hit. Even ignoring those characters, if you want to talk about the more normal ones, like Archer or Anoxa for example, they get away with it due to having multiple actions and or action advancing in their team. And even with stuff like the Sustainless Dot team that I mentioned earlier, while it's difficult to play, it is still possible thanks to ult spam and, you know, Cyrene. Apart from all those characters, there is actually one other guy who's absolutely worth talking about here as well, because he enables so many different types of teams to be played in this way too, and that's the recently buffed Well. Like, you want debuffs so that you can deal more damage with the rest of your team? He's got those. You want slows applied to the enemy so they hit you less? He can do that too. You want an action delay? I mean, yeah, he's got you covered. Like, the community joke is that Welt is actually a sustain, but really, he just offers a lot to pretty much whatever team you want to play him with. And at least for now, what Welt offers is so generic that it's usable by pretty much every other character and team in the game, and because of all the slows and delays and everything else that he has, he enables a lot of different characters to be played in this sustainless manner. And most importantly, he's a standard character that anyone can get from a 50-50 loss, not to mention if you're a more long-term player you could have gotten him for free from the 2nd anniversary standard banner selector, or more recently with the golden companion spirits that have been given out a few times now. So in short, having someone like Welt that's so easily accessible to the average player kinda creates an avenue into running sustainless teams because he's basically the perfect unit to enable it. And again, this kind of goes back to what I've been saying so far. For nearly a year now, sustainless teams have been more than viable, and honestly, I would actually go so far to say that they're being supported a little bit by how Hoyo releases characters and teams nowadays. And obviously, yes, some of it is due to shilling, like with the Elation team lowering the damage you take against those specific enemies, but even then, I still do think it's become a lot more normalized overall. Before moving forward onto the next part of this discussion, if you've been enjoying the app so far, I would appreciate if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It does help out a lot, and I mean, hey, it'd be pretty cool if you did. With all that said, so far at least, I've mostly been talking about how characters have been designed over the past year or so that gave players a reason to think about playing Sustainless. But there's also an entirely separate reason that players have been exploring Sustainless options more, and that's, well, honestly, the fact that we only have 2 sustains in the entire game that you could actually consider, you know, good. Now, I do want to be clear here, other sustains are playable. Hoyo works well enough, mostly for Elation teams right now, and if you really want to, you could play Linksha like I mentioned earlier, and Adventurine, I mean, he still does alright. But are any of those characters even remotely on the same power level as the 2 actually playable sustains? I mean, you could argue that they're somewhat in the same ballpark as Dan PT, but yeah, definitely not Hyacine. Like overall right now, if you're given the option of picking any 2 sustains, you're most likely going to pick those 2, and if you don't have them, then for the most part you're just making do with whatever happens to be available on your account. So, for players that want to take on content in scenarios where they don't have both of those characters, I mean, yeah, the obvious choice is to start considering Sustainless alongside those other quote-unquote playable options. Alongside of this, there's also Anomaly Arbitration that not only requires 3 teams, but also is generally pretty difficult to the point that the sustains that are just playable might not hold up in comparison to Hyacine or Dan PT, which is generally what the level of sustain those stages require. Like, even Hoyo, who literally just got a Nova Flare, still has the exact same problem in her kit where she has 0 mitigation and your team can just straight up get nuked without her being able to do literally anything about it. So I mean, when you get to that point, once again, the option of Sustainless comes up because part of the reason that Sustainless teams are played is because they just pump out damage. If you can defeat the enemy before they kill your team, then I mean, that's what matters, right? Obviously, not every team can do that, there's definitely some favorites when you're going up against difficult content like Anomaly Arbitration, but at the same time, it's a viable way to play the game now. And, now that I mentioned 3-team content, as a reminder, or I guess big news if you don't know, Hoyo recently announced that all 3 of the main endgame modes, which are Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, and Apocalyptic Shadow, are going to get a new mode called Starward, where you're going to be doing the same type of content, but now you have to do it with 3 teams. So that means that your Pure Fiction clear where you used to clear with, I don't know, Herda on one side and Casterus on another, well, I mean, yeah, now you're gonna have to figure out another team too. So even if you were someone that completely ignored Anomaly Arbitration, and to be clear, I don't blame you, it's kinda cringe, because it doesn't offer any Stellar Jade rewards or whatever, well, now there's 3-team content that does. And yeah, like I said earlier, there are other sustains in the game right now that are more than playable, and yeah, we're probably going to get a new sustain relatively soon to fill out the Elation Battleship team, but I guarantee you that we're going to see more than a few players attempting Sustainless runs in this future content because we simply don't have anyone good enough to be on the same level as the 2 broken sustains are with obviously Hyacine and Dan PT. Apart from that, I do think it's also worth mentioning that while there are a variety of sustains that are playable, supports and sub DPS have gotten to a point where sometimes they genuinely just offer more than what a sustain potentially could offer. Like, I keep mentioning Hyacine and Dan PT, so let's look at them for an example. Hyacine offers a massive HP boost, which helps any HP scaling team, damage mitigation, which everyone in the game likes, a very respectable amount of damage despite being a healer, not to mention her relic set, which gives the team crit damage, and also debuff cleanses. And that's discounting her light cone too. Dan PT, on the other hand, offers large shields, which are generally useful, an attack buff to one target, damage that scales off of the target that he buffs, a unique mechanic that makes him increase the buff that Sunday offers to an ally, and once again, debuff cleanses. So overall, they offer a hell of a lot to your various teams, and it makes sense as to why they're used in so many different ones. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, let's look at one of those characters that are just playable, like Lingsha. Obviously, she heals, and apart from that, she makes enemies take 25% more break damage. But that's it. So, if you've got a slot in your team where your options are 25% increased break damage, or another option that offers debuffs and slows and action delays and honestly even respectable damage like well, at least personally, I think it's more than reasonable to go with that other option. And does that mean Lingsha is bad? No, she is playable like I keep saying. But does that mean that she's in competition with those other options like well? Yeah, absolutely, which is just yet another reason as to why Sustainless teams are being played more often, at least for right now. In short, as silly as this sounds, the actually good sustains are the ones like Hyacine and Dan PT that offer a hell of a lot more to your team than, well, just the sustain. So, for example, if you look at Luocha, the only thing that he's really good for is healing. He offers basically no utility to the team apart from that, and as a result, the only time that you're really ever going to play him is when you just need to pump out as much heals as possible in large bursts, like when you play Maide, for example. And that's not exclusive to him. Most of the sustains released pre-3.x all have that kind of problem to an extent. They might be really good at one thing, like healing with Alocha, or buffing break damage with Lingsha, or even offering energy to the team with Woho. But overall, it doesn't end up mattering that much because they don't do enough beyond that. So, personally, I think that the competition per se has kind of risen to a level where just doing what I would honestly consider the bare minimum nowadays doesn't really fly anymore. And as a result, when you're offered a choice between the 2 broken sustains, an average sustain like I've been talking about, or just going sustainless with a broken support like well, I mean, yeah, it is pretty damn obvious as to why people might consider it. Lastly, one more thing I feel like I need to mention as a reason that people have been going sustainless is that at least personally, I feel like the quote-unquote level of play for HSR has actually risen quite a bit. I said this at the beginning of the video, but what used to be pretty much exclusive to Zero Cyclers is now something that realistically anyone can do as long as they want to give it a shot, and on top of that there's even varying levels of ease in terms of playing it, like we see when running a Super Break team or playing Finon, which I would consider easy, in comparison to doing like a sustainless Anoxicom, for example. Like when the base level of play rises, things that used to feel foreign become normalized, and more people seek out the potential different ways to play the game. And this is even more important when you consider that literally all of the endgame content that the game has is accompanied by a timer. Inherently, I feel that having something like that, while stressful in terms of rewards because you have to clear before the timer runs out, it does create a sort of goal that players can reach for, which obviously is, clearing the content. So if your goal is to clear, as it obviously should be, then it makes sense that players are trying out those different ways of playing. This is getting into more anecdotal territory at this point, but I know that I personally have been running Sustainless teams a hell of a lot more than I used to in the past, and to be clear, I don't even have the easiest one, which is Super Break, nor do I take the game as serious as I used to in terms of, being one of those zero cycle players. Apart from those things, I also think that running Sustainless teams is one of the very few areas of the game that has a decent bit of creativity inherently attached to it. Like, if I told you that I cleared a Knight in Anomaly Arbitration with 4 support units a year ago, first, you would probably say something along the lines of,
"Flirt, what the hell is Anomaly Arbitration?"
And second, you would probably say something along the lines of,
"Well, how'd you do that?"
And well, the answer is that you can do it with the Sustainless team compositions, and it's also something that I have done with Welt, Cyrene, RMC, and Robin. And to be clear here, that's just one weird example, but at least personally, I do kind of enjoy Sustainless team comps for that reason. It's weird, but it worked. Like, reminder here, in the current game state where battleship team compositions are kind of forcing a lot of non-battleship compositions out of the meta, it means that the amount of variety that's available to the average player kind of gets smaller and smaller as time goes on. But if you ask me, I think the exception to that rule is Sustainless team compositions, mostly because it feels like you can get away with a lot more wacky stuff. Like, if you want to run well as your quote-unquote sustain, go for it. If you want to run a win set DDD Tribby to keep your action value high, you can do that too. You want Cyrene to spam ults for your team, yeah, that works. Like, there's actually a decent amount of ways that the game can be played differently, but nowadays the best way that you can enable that, or the best way that it can actually, be viable, is by going Sustainless. And personally, I find that way of playing the game pretty fun, but I do think it's also worth noting that not every character can do it. Like, if you want to play Argenti right now, good luck doing it honestly, because I doubt you'd be able to clear a lot of content. Or say you want to try Sustainless Blade. Yeah, that might be rough due to how tied at the hip he is with Hyacine. Basically, just because it's possible in some scenarios doesn't mean it's viable with every character or against every enemy or whatever else, but in the scenarios that it does work, it gives a completely different way of clearing content, and despite that, I don't exactly think that I'm alone here in considering Sustainless as a viable way to play the game now. So with all this said, what does it mean for you as a player? Like, so far at least, I've basically just explained when Sustainless teams started to be played and also why they're being played. But it's also something that's absolutely not for everyone. Really, for the average or casual player, I don't actually think this means all that much. Like, just because someone else is doing a Sustainless run doesn't mean you have to, and like, if you're just some dude trying to clear content, then for the most part, you'll probably be trying to do it with a Sustain, as that's definitely the easier route of playing, outside of playing something like Super Break, where it's pretty much just how you play the team now. But even though it's not fully relevant to the average or casual player, I do still think all of this is important to talk about, partially just because it's been interesting to see more and more people try Sustainless stuff out, but more importantly, to also bring awareness of the fact that as we go into 4.3 with the new triple team endgame modes, at least in my opinion, Sustainless teams are only going to get more viable than they are right now, and even more so if you're someone that doesn't have the broken sustain units, which again are Dan PT and of course Hyacine. Alongside that, again, at least personally, I do actually find playing Sustainless to be pretty fun, and for the most part, I would say the fact that it's a viable strategy is actually very, very good for players. If it becomes the only way to clear, which I doubt will happen, or if it becomes harder to do, then that'd generally be a bit of a shame, because at least right now, while more people are doing it, I would still say that it's relatively niche in comparison to, just slamming Hyacine into every stage and brute forcing it with the power of fat fuck. So like, do I recommend that you play this way? Honestly, yeah, absolutely, I would. Give it a shot, and if you don't like it, then there's nothing wrong with not playing that way. Just make sure you get the next sustain whenever that releases. But if you do end up liking it, I believe that you'll unlock an essentially entirely different way of playing the game than you may be doing right now, and at least personally, I would rather play that way and reset 10 times or whatever to get the clear, than kinda just slam my head into a wall trying to clear with one of the weaker sustains, but I'm not everyone. With all that said, I do think it is worth mentioning at the end here that to a certain extent, playing Sustainless is kind of forced onto us as players. right? Like if we had 3 truly good sustains, like a third one on the tier of the 2 previously mentioned ones, then I highly doubt that this way of playing would be seen as something actually viable, or I guess necessary is the better word, in the player base's eyes. Right now, I do feel that apart from the zero cyclers that have always been doing this, people are playing this way almost out of necessity because, like I said earlier, the non-broken options don't do enough to be competitive with the rest of the roster, including supports and sub-DPS. So, when that eventual Elation sustain releases, or whenever the next meta starts and we get a new follow-up sustain, or whatever else happens, then yeah, I do kind of see Sustainless falling by the wayside again. But in the meantime, I do still think it's worth considering regardless of that fact, and at least personally, like I said, I do recommend that people give it a shot. I think it's pretty fun, and I mean, hey, maybe it'll let you play some characters in unique ways that you might not have played before. I've kind of talked about this in some of my previous videos, but right now the game does feel a little bit homogenized where you're kind of forced to play a certain way, and characters' roles have started to overlap. But again, at least in my eyes, Sustainless comps are truly where you get to be a bit wacky and still have creativity in terms of what you're playing. So all in all, I'm just saying give it a shot and see if you like it. But anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on all this, so feel free to leave a comment down below, or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.